I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sorry to interject early. We understand an invitation is to be extended to Mali to participate under Rule 37. We, of course, accept the ruling of the presidency on this, and we're happy to hear what Mali has to say. But just for the record, in case it's misinterpreted under the wording of Rule 37, we do not accept the premise that Mali's interests are specially affected by Western weapons transfers to Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. The Russian Federation has requested for the floor. I give them the floor.
Thank you, distinguished Mr. President. I'd like to thank the distinguished representative of the UK. Perhaps he would like to explain in which way a whole number of EU countries' interests are specifically affected when they are invited under Rule 37. The interests of Mali are affected directly because that country encountered the impact of Ukraine's support for terrorism, and Malian people have died. I can get into more detail on that if you wish.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Mali to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Adeji Ebo, Director and Deputy to the High Representative of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I give the floor to Mr. Adeji Ebo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I am providing this briefing on behalf of the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu. The Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, launched on 24 February 2022, in violation of the UN Charter and of international law, continues to inflict large-scale suffering on the people of Ukraine. Regrettably, the security situation continues to deteriorate. The escalating attacks on Ukrainian regions have led to more civilian deaths and injuries, as well as massive destruction of civilian infrastructure, including energy, health, and education facilities. The Secretary General remains greatly concerned by the worsening impact on civilians from the increased fighting in eastern Ukraine, as well as along the Ukrainian-Russian border, including in the Kursk and Belgorod regions of the Russian Federation. He urges all to act responsibly and ensure the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. The continued and intensified attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are unacceptable. All parties to any armed conflict have an obligation to protect civilians in armed conflict, as well as to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. Let me say it clearly. Directing an attack against civilians or civilian objects is prohibited. I also reiterate that the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack in international humanitarian law must be respected. All attacks contrary to these obligations must stop immediately. Mr. President, turning now to the subject of this briefing, the provision of military assistance and transfers of arms and ammunition to the armed forces of Ukraine have continued. Information from various governments regarding these transfers is accessible through open sources. The transfers have reportedly included heavy conventional weapons such as battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircraft, helicopters, large caliber artillery systems, missile systems, and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions and small arms and light weapons and their ammunition. There have also been reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons such as uncrewed aerial vehicles, ballistic missiles, and ammunition to the Russian Federation, to the Russian armed forces, and that these weapons have been used in Ukraine. I reiterate that any transfer of weapons and ammunition must take place consistently with applicable international legal framework, including, of course, relevant Security Council resolutions. Reports related to the use of cluster munitions and widespread contamination with mines and explosive remnants of war in Ukraine are deeply concerning. The universal participation in and the full implementation of the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines and on their destruction, and the Convention on Cluster Munitions and the Convention on Prohibitions or Restrictions on the Use of Certain Conventional Weapons must remain a priority. I appeal to all states to uphold their obligations under these treaties and to reaffirm their value and importance. Mr. President, to mitigate the human cost of weapons, states must exercise utmost responsibility in their arms and ammunition transfers. Last week, state parties to the Arms Trade Treaty convened in Geneva for the 10th Conference of State Parties. They acknowledged the importance of universal adherence to and effective implementation of the treaty in advancing its purpose to contribute to international and regional peace, security, and stability, reduce human suffering, and promote cooperation, transparency, and responsible action by state parties in the international trade in conventional arms. The transfer of weapons and ammunition into any armed conflict carries the risk of diversion and, by extension, raises serious escalation concerns. Measures to prevent and mitigate the risk of diversion of weapons and ammunition are key for preventing further instability and insecurity in Ukraine, the region, and beyond. Such efforts by all states involved in arms transfers will also be essential to post-conflict recovery. This requires supply chain transparency and cooperation and information exchange between importing, transit, and exporting countries. Diversion risks exist at each stage of the life cycle of a weapon, including manufacture, before and during transfer, post-delivery storage in stockpiles, and end use or disposal. Concrete counter-diversion measures include enhancement of marking at the time of manufacture and import, record keeping and tracing practices, comprehensive pre-transfer diversion, risk assessments, end-user certificates, including non-transfer clauses, post-shipment verifications, and diversion monitoring and analysis. In June this year, states met to review progress made in the implementation of the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons and its international tracing instrument. States adopted by consensus action-oriented measures for 2024-2030 in order to prevent, combat, and eradicate the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons throughout their life cycle. All states should now implement these commitments and other related commitments, including those in the Global Framework for Through-Life Conventional Ammunition Management, as well as the obligations under all instruments to which they are a party to prevent the diversion of arms and regulate the international arms trade. Mr. President, since 24 February 2022, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 35,869 civilian casualties in Ukraine, 11,662 killed, and 24,207 injured. According to OHCHR, regrettably, July 2024 was the deadliest month for civilians in Ukraine since October 2022, with at least 219 civilians killed and 1,018 injured. The use of armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles by the Russian Federation continues to cause civilian deaths and injuries, as well as damage to civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. In addition, there have also been reports of a number of cross-border strikes using missiles and uncrewed aerial vehicles by Ukraine inside the Russian Federation, with some, according to Russian authorities, reportedly resulting in civilian casualties. Just like any other weapons or weapons systems, armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles must not be used in a manner inconsistent with international humanitarian law. All parties to an armed conflict should refrain from any actions that could endanger civilians, including by avoiding the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and ultimately should aim to take combat out of urban areas altogether. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I wish to reiterate the United Nations commitment to support all meaningful efforts to bring a just and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant General Assembly resolutions. It is time to put an end to this conflict. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Mr. Ebo for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We carefully listened to the information provided by Mr. Ebo. Dear colleagues, 2 days ago, Western delegations gathered the members of the Security Council here for their ritual monthly briefing on Ukraine. But the aim, apart from just ticking a box as to why they did this, is a mystery to all of us. Because, frankly, nothing apart from just having anti-Russian tropes and fakes has occurred. And from the statements of our Western colleagues, we were able to conclude that they basically gathered the members of the Security Council together to draw attention to the 33rd anniversary of the Day of Independence of Ukraine. So, in order to keep afloat Ukraine as a topic in the Security Council, much valuable time was wasted, and the Council could have spent that time on many more important subjects of concern to the international community. Furthermore, the fact that the Security Council chamber saw once again speakers under Rule 37, and namely the EU delegations who just repeat themselves, added absolutely no added value whatsoever and just wasted precious time. In this regard, we'd like to remind you that our Western colleagues in March used all their efforts to block a requested by Russia meeting of the 25th anniversary of the NATO aggression against Yugoslavia. So, as you recall, and in particular, the French PR was impassioned about this. They stated that the Council would not commemorate any anniversary, but so we hadn't asked for anything, but all we wanted to do was to recall that the impact of the NATO aggression in the Balkans is still being felt by the inhabitants of the entire Balkans, and they are in no way safer now. So we have encountered once again with egregious double standards from our Western colleagues who seem to be using this as their calling card. I am sure that they're going to bat around this calling card today as well, because they're going to say that today's meeting is a waste of time. But the fact is that it is actually dedicated to a very important topical issue, the Western supply of arms to the Kiev regime, and this being a factor preventing the peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. Distinguished colleagues, we're all aware that the main phase of the Ukrainian crisis started 2.5 years ago, and Russia had to start its SMO to protect the inhabitants of Donbass and to eradicate the threat from Ukraine. Today, it is perfectly clear that this phase would not have started if our former Western partners had not supplied Ukraine with weapons and prepared it for conflict with Russia, hiding behind the Minsk agreements in doing so that was approved by the Security Council of the UN in Resolution 2202 in 2015. So, indeed, the Ukrainian crisis would not exist if Washington and its allies had not brought to power in 2014 as a result of an anti-constitutional coup radical national and Nazi opposition that focused on eradicating everything from our country that links it to Russia, our shared culture, language, and our shared history. As a result, the Kiev regime in the same year started a war against population in the east and the southeast that we came to stop in February 2022. Thus, the destructive role of the West in this ongoing Ukrainian tragedy is clear. The Ukrainian leadership, as we're all well aware, had an excellent chance to find a way out of this vicious, terrible cycle just a month after the beginning of the SMO. Then in Istanbul, there were initial documents that were very beneficial for that country. A necessary bilateral document. However, a number of Western leaders, and in particular the former British PM Boris Johnson, made sure that President Zelensky would reject this agreement because with the assistance of Western weapons, he could inflict a defeat upon Russia and get the country's borders back to 1991. The reasons for this is absolutely clear. It was not for nothing that they spent so much effort in making Ukraine into an anti-Russian entity that would be able to weaken our country and thus reconcile these brotherly Slavic nations. This warped logic of the former colonizers acting as part of the divide and rule concept is something that our African and Asian colleagues truly recall. What on earth the Ukrainians were thinking about at that time is hard to say. As a result, there was the senseless pumping to Ukraine of Western weapons. There was old Soviet stuff that had to be used in any case. But then the Kiev regime got fairly modern Western equipment, tanks, APCs, artillery equipment, MLLSs, and the most important, ammunition and long-range missiles. According to the data on the internet, in February 2024, the overall volume of Western assistance to Ukraine was 243 billion euros. And since then, data on military assistance to Ukraine from Western countries has been hidden. But as of the end of 2023, the overall volume of military assistance from NATO countries was 98 billion euros, the EU 27 billion euros. So 125 billion euros in total, and that is more than half of all the resources allocated to Ukraine. As we all recall, in the first half of 2024, the US, with much wailing, nevertheless allocated a new package of military assistance to the Kyiv regime to the tune of $61 billion. Given the smaller deliveries from other NATO countries, we can say confidently that in 2024, the overall volume of military assistance from the West to the Zelensky regime was 200 billion euros. So I'm talking in such detail about this so that our colleagues from the Global South really understand this figure. We have said that the overall requirements of all humanitarian agencies in 2023 was $56.7 billion. And so that is 4 times less. And it was financed at 38.3%. Now, I'm not even talking about the fact that the US, as the biggest contributor to the UN budget, still cannot pay a paltry amount in comparison, just $1 billion, to our organization that's causing the liquidity crisis in our organization. It's clear that assistance to Ukraine, and military assistance in particular, is a source of revenue for Western weapons manufacturers. American leaders themselves convinced Congress to approve the latest package, and this saying that this is a beneficial business program and this would create more jobs in the US. As regards the Kiev regime itself, well, it as a minimum, after the failed counter-offensive in 2023, used up its ammunition completely and weapons completely. And so now it's completely dependent on Western supplies. But they're still coming, although Ukraine for the West is a sort of suitcase without handles now, really. But the US and its satellites are still not prepared to give it up. So let's come to the main conclusion here. Without Western supplies of arms to Ukraine, they would have stopped fighting a long time ago. And that is something that Western politicians, including Mr. Borrell from his Garden of Flowers, admitted. The aim of the SMO was not to destroy Ukraine as a state. So the pointless meat grinder would have stopped. And this is something that the Ukrainian president is hanging on to because of his own geopolitical interests. And so tens of thousands of his own citizens wouldn't have gone into it and would have been sent to hundreds of thousands of his own citizens would not have been sent there. And they're desperately trying to avoid being sent to the front. Now, regarding the fact that the Ukrainians don't want to fight, well, that's absolutely clear. We can see that from the Ukrainian news. Men are hauled off the streets and sent to the front practically without any training to certain death. So it's absolutely not astonishing that desertion in the Ukrainian army has got to unimagined scale. Since the beginning of the SMO in Ukraine, more than 63,000 cases were started on this in the first 6 months of 2024 alone. According to the General Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine, there were about 30,000 cases started. This is twice as many as in 2020. Experts believe that the real statistic is actually 2 to 3 times higher. So, colleagues, make no mistake. The bloody Ukrainian head honcho can make his people fight only through force and coercion, and only thanks to the supplies of Western weapons, Western intelligence, Western instructors and mercenaries. That is why the topic of today's meeting is so important and pertinent. Mr. President, today We undoubtedly will hear from our Western colleagues the hackneyed statements about the determination of them to support Ukraine as long as they need, because apparently it's fighting for its survival and it's a victim of aggression. But in August, the head of the Ukrainian junta made a fatal mistake by pushing his forces over the border into a peaceful Russian region. The world, as I said 2 days ago, saw the pictures of the Ukrainian murderers with Nazi symbols looting and marauding, taking hostages and firing at women, children, and old persons. This was so far from the image of the innocent victim of aggression that the US and its satellites have sought so hard to paint Ukraine as, that it means that now they're seeking to slightly disown Zelensky. But the facts speak for themselves. You, ladies and gentlemen, are entangled in this foray. Without your assistance, without your Western weapons, the Ukrainian head honcho would not have been able to do this. The director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency of the US, Frank Whitworth, on the 28th of August, confessed that the Ukrainian army is using satellite images supplied by them in the attack in the Kursk region. The Ukrainian army, as you recall, can't do much itself, so the Kursk foray, to a great extent, took place thanks to the use of Western mercenaries. And they're not even hiding this fact. This is directly announced on the Forward Observation Group, a PMC from the US. Incidentally, there are photos of the military positions, of mortars, and they have been located on a children's playground. So it's really obvious to our Western colleagues, there are obviously these gross violations of IHL, and this is something they recently travelled to Geneva to discuss. In order to achieve its aims, our Western hypocrites there's nothing that they don't stoop to. On the 12th of August, a repair unit of Rossete was fired at with chemical weapons. That is something that is characteristic for the US Army and that of Germany. Chemical weapons strikes were also born on Russian areas on the 21st of August. In the Kursk region, a part of the 74th radiochemical unit of the Ukrainian army was redeployed. And this is coming with the oversight of Washington, London, and Brussels. There are manuals that we found where Ukrainian army soldiers are trained to use chemical ammunition with the use of artillery systems. Furthermore, Kyiv got about 500 tons of tritalamine that is used to for the chemical component of this. I'd like to remind you here that Western moralists have already sent highly enriched uranium and cluster munitions to Ukraine. Incidentally, there was information recently that the US is sending cluster munitions to Ukraine. This is taking place through Germany. They're kept there in Mizau. Publicly, Germany is against the transfer of such ammunition to Kyiv, and it is a participant to the international treaty that bans the use of that weapon. Distinguished colleagues, the Kursk foray of Zelensky, something I talked about in great detail 2 days ago. I'm not going to go into details now. There are Abrams, Leopards, HIMARS, ATAMS, the Russian, and then the Donbass region is being bombed and shelled. Yesterday, there was Ukraine lost its first F-16 that was supplied to it. So what exactly is left of the Kyiv regime that is facing utter collapse? Just one thing: having a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO, headed up by the US. Kyiv just doesn't have another plan B. for this, the easiest thing is to create a huge provocation like Butcher and accuse Russia of it. We warned about this a few days ago, that the Kyiv regime is planning for a provocation of a dirty nuclear bomb. But this is very complex, and carrying it out without Western backers is extremely difficult. So there's another option. So get permission for strikes far into Russian territory by using Western missiles. Washington and most other capitals have stopped at that at the moment. They do understand that this would lead to an enormous escalation that would go far beyond the borders of just Ukraine. And with all the nuclear power implications that would have. But Zelensky is kind of, the US is being visited by the head of the presidential Ukrainian office, Andrei Yermak, and Rustem Ermov, who is conducting meetings with representatives of the US administration to try and convince them to lift restrictions on long-range strikes using American weapons into Russian territory. Colleagues, this is what the right now looks like. The Ukrainian head honcho has focused on escalation by attacking Kursk. So there's a question, is he going to win thanks to the Ukrainian suitcase without handles, so to speak, and its allies and the US? So much is going to depend here on the countries of the global south that are talking that the world is trying to deceive. But we'd like to believe that we will hear your assessments and views on this today in this chamber. Distinguished colleagues, in conclusion, I'd like to draw your attention to another topic linked to Ukraine. On the 20th of August, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine adopted a law having any religious communities in Ukraine being affiliated with any religious organization in Russia to be taken to court. The court would suffice just having a religious expert opinion that could be easily falsified, and that would lead to a case. The document obviously is against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Its aim is to eliminate it and all of its congregation, or force it to join other religious organizations. Hundreds of monasteries, millions of Orthodox believers in Ukraine risk losing their legal rights and even losing their property and place of worship. The law is not in line with the Constitution of Ukraine or the rule of law. In essence, it is a political declaration that seeks to legalize the destruction of religious communities of the majority. This is an unprecedented anti-democratic decision, and even the Pope condemned it, who has not particularly been pro-Russian. The law allocates criteria allowing a group of people who are part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but basically it's a form of political repression. And this is accompanied by egregious attacks on believers, threats, blackmail, violence, and beatings. There have been hundreds of criminal cases opened, but they were all on for political grounds. And people have been arrested, detained. A number of pastors and other higher-ups in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. We talked about this repeatedly in the Security Council chamber. It did help stop the repression a bit, but an absence of due response to this from the West has made it difficult and made that the Ukrainians can continue. We have no doubt that stopping this terrible events in Ukraine and causing yet another confrontation in the country is the moral duty of each person, irrespective of that person's faith. It's important for somebody to believe just in something, The heads of the Kiev regime clearly don't want this. And there's this terrible Russophobia, and they are whipping this up time after time. We trust that in these circumstances, all of our colleagues who in their hearts and minds have some kind of faith will take a principled position and say no to this. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. My gratitude goes to Mr. Ebo for the briefing. Despite having a council meeting on the situation in Ukraine less than 48 hours ago, deeply concerning hostile attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, including energy, continues unabated. This includes the large-scale Russian attacks this week that saw hundreds of missiles and drones raining down across Ukraine in one of the largest bombing campaigns over the last 30 months of this senseless war of aggression. This week's spasm of violence against civilians is not an anomaly. July was the deadliest month for civilians in Ukraine since October 2022, with at least 219 civilians killed that month alone. Yet again, Ukraine was plunged into eerie darkness as tens of thousands were forced into makeshift underground shelters, taking cover from multiple waves of deadly indiscriminate fire. We once again urge Russia to end this war by withdrawing its troops from the territories of Ukraine, as affirmed by multiple UNGA resolutions. Indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian objects, including energy infrastructure, are clear violations of international humanitarian law and must be condemned unequivocally. We also reiterate our consistent position that Ukraine is defending its people and territories in line with the UN Charter and international law, alongside the international community's assistance. For this reason, we are of the view that today's meeting on the issue of weapons transferred to Ukraine is irrelevant. And my delegation again underlines that arms transfers between Russia and DPRK, which are flagrant Security Council violations, continue to endanger civilians and prolong this brutal war. This must be resolutely condemned and, in fact, should be the focus of today's Council meeting. We also note with great concern the Ukraine authorities' announcement that North Korea's ballistic missile were recently used against by Russia to strike Ukraine. We strongly urge Russia and DPRK once again to abide by the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. In closing, Mr. President, the Republic of Korea is committed to aligning itself with the ideals of the UN Charter and justice. We will continue to stand with Ukraine and its people until they secure a just and lasting peace in their lands. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I too begin by thanking Mr. Ebo for his briefing. It is unfortunate that the Russian Federation continues to request repeated meetings on this topic in an attempt to distract the international community with a narrative that distorts reality. Malta continues to condemn the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine. We reiterate Ukraine's inherent right to defend itself, as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter, and to rely on its allies in doing so. Just this week, the Russian Federation continued to intensify its missile and drone attacks in a number of Ukrainian regions. These attacks included the complete destruction of a hotel in Kryvyi Rih, drone attacks in Zaporizhia, and a large attack with missiles and drones on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. For months, Ukraine's electricity grid has faced repeated Russian missile and drone attacks, resulting in the destruction of about half of the country's generating capacity. The continued and intensified attacks affecting civilian and civilian infrastructure are deeply concerning. Malta reiterates the need to adhere to international humanitarian law. The principles of proportionality and distinction, as well as the special protections afforded to children, must be adhered to at all times in order to reduce the risk of harm to civilians. Regrettably, the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate. According to OCHA, more than 14.6 million people require some form of humanitarian assistance. We take this opportunity to also thank OCHA and other humanitarian actors who responded immediately after the massive attacks on Ukraine, which were conducted this week. Malta is equally concerned about recent reports related to the use of cluster munitions and widespread contamination with mines and explosive remnants of war. Protecting the people of Ukraine and ensuring recovery from the devastation caused by Russia's war requires that demining happens without delay. We stress once again the need for full accountability for all crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. We also support the ongoing work of the ICC and the Register of Damage for Ukraine. To conclude, Mr. President, Malta reiterates that there is only one path to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, along with an end to the inflicted suffering on Ukrainians. This is for Russia to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Until that day comes, Ukraine has the right to defend itself against this aggression, as well as protect its very existence as an independent and sovereign country. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank Director Ebo for his briefing. Mr. President, let me make a couple of points on behalf of my delegation. Firstly, weapons transfers to conflict areas are an important topic for my country, and it is important that this Council addresses them in the framework of conflict prevention and with a view of protecting civilians. Inadequately controlled supply of arms to parties to armed conflict has the potential to facilitate violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. At the same time, it can hamper the delivery of life-saving humanitarian aid. However, it strikes us that we are approaching the discussions on weapons transfers pertaining to the war in Ukraine from the wrong end. Weapons transfers to Ukraine are not happening in a vacuum. They support legitimate self-defensive efforts of a sovereign country. Secondly, Slovenia rejects aggression in absolute terms. We will not stand idly by while a whole sovereign country is being reduced to rubble by its larger neighbor, while civilians are being killed, maimed, and arbitrarily detained, and while ballistic missiles and drones are hitting children's hospitals and critical energy infrastructure. Mr. President, we deplore any attempts at undermining the right to self-defense. Every country has a right to defend itself in line with Article 51 of the UN Charter, and they also have a right to procure the means to do so in line with international law. Slovenia will do its part and will keep supporting Ukraine until there is an aggressor on its soil. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to Mr. Ebo for his briefing. Since calling this meeting and accusing the West of escalation, Russia has bombarded cities across 15 regions of sovereign Ukraine, more than half the country, using hundreds of drones, cruise missiles, hypersonic ballistic missiles, glide bombs, and more, some of which were procured from Iran and DPRK in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Moscow's intent is to terrorize the civilian population in Ukraine into submission. The latest attacks have caused widespread blackouts, cutting off access for ordinary people to power, heating, and water. Imagine that happening to your country. Direct attacks on civilian infrastructure constitute a war crime. Ukraine has a right to defend itself under Article 51 of the Charter against Russia's attacks. This does not preclude its right to project force into Russian territory, so long as any action complies with international law. Russia cannot step up the war from its own soil while increasing attacks on civilian infrastructure and expects Ukraine not to seek to remove the source of the threat. We will continue to provide Ukraine with the capabilities it needs to defend its people. Neither the UK nor our partners seek direct confrontation with Russia, nor a wider escalation of tensions. Let me be clear, there is only one aggressor here. It was Russia that willingly and deliberately tore into the security of Europe by illegally invading a sovereign country. It was Russia that unilaterally sought to annex a neighbour's land against every principle the international system and all of us here rely on. It was Russia that chose to use hypersonic missiles and other advanced weaponry against civilians and their infrastructure. And it was Russia, at the start of the war, that chose to illegally seize the largest nuclear power plant in Europe at Zaporizhia, even recklessly installing military equipment in the turbine hall and on reactor roofs. Russian disinformation and threats and false accusations will not deter the UK or our allies from our steadfast support for Ukraine, including providing it with the capabilities it needs to defend its people. We remain committed to securing a just and lasting peace for Ukraine and for Europe, in line with the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank Mr. Ebo for his briefing. Russia claims to be concerned about escalation in Ukraine, and yet it holds all the cards to prevent such a scenario. All they need to do is put an end to their aggression and withdraw from the territory which is internationally recognized of Ukraine. With these repeated meetings, Russia would like to make us believe that supporting Ukraine is fueling escalation. Nobody is fooled. The support of the international community annoys Russia because it's an obstacle to its schemes. It's preventing the annexation of a territory of a sovereign state, modification of its borders by force, and violating the UN Charter. It's preventing it from dictating its foreign policy and defense policy, striking at its civilian infrastructure, and depriving its people of water, gas, and electricity. Russia clearly only understands the balance of power. The Russian representative last Tuesday mentioned the so-called peace proposal formulated by President Putin last June. And yet this proposal is about setting as a condition the complete surrender of Ukraine, abandon of its sovereignty, and of its territorial integrity. France will continue to provide Ukraine with the military support which is vital to its protection of its airspace and land and population in keeping with the Charter, Article 51. Russia attacks Ukraine in its border regions from its military sites located behind the Russian border. The Ukrainians need to adapt and hit the sites from which Russia is conducting its aggression. It needs to be able to neutralize military targets which are directly involved in operations aimed at them. This is an exercise by Ukraine in its legitimate defense, and it's not limited just to Ukrainian territory. Mr. President, Ukraine, in its fight for the defense of the goals and principles of the Charter, is supported by the crushing majority of United Nations member states. Russia is supplying itself in arms, ballistic missiles, and munitions with North Korea, and thus unscrupulously jeopardizing the international regime of nonproliferation, which is the safeguard of our collective security. To cover its violations of Council resolutions, Russia has not hesitated to rid itself of the experts of the 1718 Committee, thereby depriving member states of the United Nations of an essential source of information on the implementation of sanctions targeting North Korea. Russia has chosen to acquire armed drones from Iran, which is a violation of Resolution 2231. If Russia were to transfer ballistic missiles to Russia, we are prepared to respond quickly in a coordinated manner, including with new large-scale measures. France urges all states to refrain from supplying Russia with assets that are dual usage and elements that could fuel its war of aggression. There's no other way to bring there's no other alternative to bring Russia to stopping its war of aggression than to steadfast support to Ukraine in a military manner. Surrender by the attacked party cannot be a condition for a peace negotiation. In any case, it will never serve as a basis for a lasting and long peace, upholding international law, which is the only path to restoring enduring peace and international security. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like at the outset to thank Mr. Ebo for his briefing. Mr. President, 2 years and a half have passed since the beginning of the crisis in Ukraine. And here we are today meeting, and no peaceful solution seems to be on track. The situation on the ground is even worsening on both sides of the borders, with more deplorable casualties and more suffering amongst civilians. Mr. President, Algeria reiterates its deep concern over the continued confrontation and calls once again the parties to exert restraint, to preserve lives and to prevent more escalation. In this regard, I would like to make 3 points today. First, we reiterate our deep concern over the use of increasingly lethal and destructive weapons and ammunition in conflict zones in Ukrainian and Russian territories. Arms flow in conflict zones will certainly lead to more loss of lives and prolonged suffering for populations. It also nurtures the conflict and distances everyone away from any peaceful solution to the conflict. Second, it is critical for the parties to respect their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. Targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure is unacceptable under any circumstance and is prohibited by international humanitarian law. We therefore reiterate our call to abandon the logic of confrontation and to prioritize protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Alleviating the suffering of people should be at the top of the priorities for all parties. Finally, an inclusive and constructive dialogue should be given a real chance to deliver. There should not be any room for polarization in this conflict. Diplomacy should take the lead by joining all efforts towards a peaceful settlement of this dispute. In closing, Mr. President, we have a firm conviction that a just and lasting peace based on the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and the legitimate security concerns of all parties as a key to resolving this conflict. I thank you.
Representative of Algeria for their statement. And I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, UNODA Director Ebo, for your briefing. Colleagues, as we all know, Russia started this war by invading Ukraine in clear violation of the UN Charter. Russia's alleged concern that UN member states are helping Ukraine defend itself is nothing short of absurd. If Russia would like to have a discussion on the risks resulting from weapons transfers, then let us have a real one. As Russia deploys chemical weapons on the battlefield, and continues to kill civilians and destroy Ukrainian critical infrastructure. Iran, the DPRK, and China are providing Russia with the material support it needs to wage its war of choice. First, Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Iran is fueling Russia's aggression with direct military support, providing lethal weapons, which the Kremlin is using with devastating effect against Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure. Just a few days ago, on the anniversary of Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union, Russia reportedly used approximately 100 Shahed UAVs and glide bombs in a major attack targeting critical infrastructure throughout Ukraine, including the electricity grid, power plants, and natural gas facilities. Russia procures or produces these UAVs thanks to its partnership with Iran. We remain seriously concerned by the consequences of Iran potentially transferring ballistic missiles and related technology to Russia. If Iran were to move forward with the transfer of ballistic missiles to Russia, it would represent a dramatic escalation and a serious risk to international peace and security. Iran's support for Russia's war of aggression threatens European security and illustrates how Iran's destabilizing influence reaches beyond the Middle East and around the world. Then there are DPRK's arms transfers. In its attacks this past weekend, Russia fired at least 6 possible North Korean-supplied ballistic missiles. Since late December 2023, Russia has fired upwards of 65 North Korean-supplied ballistic missiles on Ukraine. The DPRK has unlawfully transferred dozens of ballistic missiles and more than 16,500 containers of munitions and munitions-related material to Russia, prolonging the suffering of the Ukrainian people. Russia's procurement of DPRK ballistic missiles violates the UN arms embargo on the DPRK that Russia itself supported in this council. Colleagues, Moscow's military cooperation with Pyongyang is cynical and dangerous. The Kremlin shields the DPRK from UN scrutiny of its unlawful nuclear and ballistic missile development programs in exchange for the DPRK's material support to Russia's war of choice. By doing so, Russia undermines the UN Charter and the principles of nonproliferation, the importance of which Russia used to recognize. Let me also address the significant support Russia receives from China and the two countries' so-called no-limits strategic partnership, which props up Russia's defense industrial base and enables it to continue an illegal war against Ukraine. China is exporting to Russia nitrocellulose, machine tools, microelectronics, optics, and UAV and cruise missile technology that Russia deploys in its attacks against civilians and Ukraine's infrastructure. We have seen a massive buildup of Russia's weaponry over the last year and a half, including tanks, missiles, and munitions, all fueled by China's dual-use imports. China cannot have it both ways. It cannot claim to be for peace and want better relations with Europe, while at the same time fueling the most significant threat to European security since the end of the Cold War. If the Russian Federation were serious about international peace and security, rather than wasting our time in this venue with bad faith arguments and counter-accusations steeped in disinformation, the Kremlin would have agreed to participate in Ukraine's second peace summit earlier this year. I would also like to point out the falsehood in Russia's narrative that, quote, Western countries support Ukraine. In fact, countries that stand with the democratically elected government of Ukraine in defense of the UN's Charter's principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity represent all geographic regions of the globe, not just Western countries. The United States will continue to stand with those countries. We will continue to call for justice for the victims of the Kremlin's war of aggression and accountability for those responsible. And we will continue to call out those who enable Russia in its brutal war of aggression against the people of Ukraine. And finally, Mr. President, I would just like to add a response to a comment that was made by the representative of the Russian Federation. Russia, as we have all heard many, many, many times, claims that the West is trying to weaken Russia. The West is not weakening Russia. However, through its use of chemical weapons, its war of aggression against Ukraine, its use of Wagner forces to terrorize Africans, its nuclear saber-rattling, its interference in democratic elections around the globe, its support for terror groups in the Middle East, Russia is doing an excellent job of that all by itself. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I thank the representative of the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Ebo, for his remarks. As a global community, we are bound by a series of principles and rules that we have pledged to uphold. This includes the UN Charter, which sets out the principles to live by in peace with one another as good neighbours, and which enshrines the prohibition of the use of force, the right to self-defence, and the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. And then there are the Geneva Conventions, which aim to mitigate the horrors of war by establishing minimum humanitarian standards to be respected in armed conflict. 2 days ago, we met to discuss the political and security situation in Ukraine. We stressed that the gravity of the current situation, the heightened tensions and the suffering of the Ukrainian population, and indeed of the Russian population too, are a direct result of Russia's military aggression. We condemn this military aggression and reject any attempt to evade this responsibility. Let me also reiterate that Ukraine has the right to ensure its security and to defend its territorial integrity and sovereignty. In the light of the continuing hostilities, 2 key messages clearly stand out. First, it is imperative to bring an end to this ongoing war. Secondly, it is unacceptable for civilians to continue to pay the price. From the outset, we've called on Russia to end its military aggression and withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory. It is appalling that despite these calls, reiterated by the vast majority of the General Assembly and the International Court of Justice, the military aggression persists, exacerbated by the transfer of arms and munitions to Russia from third parties in apparent contravention of the obligations arising from resolutions of this Council. I reiterate that states must respect and comply with their obligations under international arms control instruments. Regarding the protection of civilians, Switzerland expresses its deep concern and sorrow over the numerous lives lost, the wounded and the immense suffering caused by this military aggression, wherever it may occur. Our position in this regard is firmly rooted in international humanitarian law and human rights. We remind all parties to the conflict of their obligation to place the protection of civilians and those no longer taking part in hostilities at the forefront. Mr. President, as one of the signatories of the Geneva Convention said in 1949, we know today that war never solves the problems that gave rise to it. It is always followed by long years of suffering for the vanquished and for the victors, and its results are not commensurate with the evil it generates. I would like to stress that it is our collective responsibility to ensure that the principles to which we have committed ourselves be respected in order to pave the way for a more beautiful and just world, including in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank Director Ebo for the briefing. I am wondering how many times Russia will continue to repeat the same rhetoric. It consistently provocates the claim that Ukraine's defense efforts, along with the international community's support for these efforts, threaten international peace and security. However, Russia did not call for the Security Council meeting on its own initiative. Instead, it requests such meeting out of spite whenever someone else does. This behavior mocks the Security Council. Simultaneously, Russia speaks of peace and de-escalation while conducting large-scale air raids, including on Kiev. Today's meeting represents another instance of this mockery, yet it is not surprising. Russia's hypocrisy is nothing new. Violations of the UN Charter, disregards of international humanitarian law, and breaches of Security Council resolutions persist. Russia has also procured missiles from North Korea in violation of relevant Security Council resolutions and refused to renew the mandate of the panel of experts, which had played a crucial role in monitoring the implementation of the resolutions. Russia employs any means necessary to continue its illegal actions. Despite being a permanent member of the Security Council, entrusted with the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and stability, Russia abuses its position, using the Council as a platform for disinformation. Today, it deliberately confuses the victim and aggressor, falsely suggesting that efforts to defend against an unprovoked war of aggression are the cause of prolonged conflict and delayed peace. This stance is entirely unacceptable. However, no matter how much Russia tries to mislead the world, no reasonable person would believe its narrative, and we are united in affirming that its aggression against Ukraine continues nothing but a flagrant violation of the UN Charter. Nothing more, nothing less. Upholding the international order based on the UN Charter remains of utmost importance for every country in the world. Yet, Russia clearly does not share this belief. Russia may believe there is no way out but to continue its reckless attempts to distort the facts. However, I would like to say to my Russian colleagues, there is a way out. Withdraw immediately to the internationally recognized border of Ukraine. This is the action required to achieve peace now. End your sophistry in Security Council. Abide by international law. Respect the sovereignty of other countries, and stop your war of aggression. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to thank the Deputy High Representative, Mr. Abo, for his informative briefing. Ecuador has maintained a clear stance on this topic. Along those lines, we support the recommendations put forth once again by the Deputy High Representative around the measures that are necessary in order to mitigate the risks that stem from increasing weapons and arms and munitions. Ecuador reiterates the importance of the transfer of arms and munitions being carried out in a way that's strictly within the legal framework internationally applicable and in conformity with the relevant Security Council resolutions. Ecuador recognizes the introduction of weapons and munitions in conflict zones can contribute to escalation of the conflict and create risks that will persist beyond the cessation of hostilities. Thus, we believe it is vital to adopt effective measures to mitigate the risk of diversion, illicit traffic, or abuse of arms and munitions in order to prevent greater instability and insecurity in the region, including during the post-conflict recuperation and recovery phase. Ecuador is particularly concerned that while hostilities are intensifying and expanding beyond the battlefield is expanding, we see the window of opportunity for dialogue and negotiation closing. The indiscriminate use of arms in urban areas, attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, and proliferation of munitions, anti-personnel mines, and cluster munitions are all clear examples of how the violence causes irreparable ravages for the civilian population which Ecuador cannot but reject. It is imperative that the parties to the conflict rethink their actions and adopt a genuine political compromise to put an end to this war. History has shown that no conflict has ever been resolved in a sustainable manner, in a military manner. The world cannot afford a conflict of greater proportions. My delegation reiterates its call to end the violence, to stop the illegal occupation of Ukraine, and to return to diplomacy and dialogue in order to restore peace in the context of respecting the territorial integrity, political independence of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. To conclude, Mr. President, Ecuador recognizes the sovereign right of states to their legitimate defense, which should be strictly defined by the provisions of Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, I thank Director Adede Ebo for his briefing. Mr. President, the war in Ukraine continues to be a matter of utmost concern, with recent developments highlighting the gravity and escalating nature of this conflict and the urgent need for international attention. The persistent cycle of reciprocal attacks has been a constant feature since the war's inception. It reflects a dangerous spiral that threatens broader international peace and stability. The protracted war in Ukraine, marked by a relentless arms race, serves as a stark reminder of the fragile balance that could swiftly deteriorate into a wider European conflagration. We observe with great apprehension that each announcement of major weapon supplies is met with threats of further escalation, propelling us towards critical thresholds or red lines, including the involvement of nuclear powers and the drawing of additional countries into conflict. It is imperative to acknowledge that violence begets violence, and arms transfer inevitably trigger further arms transfer and military alliances, creating a perilous cycle. What began as a localized bilateral conflict is now dangerously morphing into multilateral conflagration, pulling in actors both near and distant from the battlefield. We should recognize that such an expansion poses a severe threat to global stability. Mr. President, we have consistently warned that the pursuit of strategic advantage and favorable concessions before engaging in dialogue, which is the permeating logic in this conflict, would likely lead to further escalation rather than de-escalation. To prevent this war from becoming entrenched and to avert a protracted stalemate, we urgently call for, first, adherence to strict arms controls in line with applicable international arms trade frameworks. Second, recommitment to diplomatic engagement and de-escalation efforts, focusing on avenues for negotiation and conflict resolution, including direct dialogue among the primary belligerents with the support of international stakeholders acceptable to both. Third, implementation of confidence-building measures to reduce direct confrontation between warring parties, creating the necessary space for diplomatic efforts to take root and prevent the conflict from reaching a point of no return. Ultimately, Mr. President, the decision to escalate or expand this conflict depends on the involved parties. Nevertheless, it is crucial to emphasize the importance of diplomacy, dialogue, and adherence to international law in resolving disputes. In this regard, the international community, including the UN Security Council, as well as influential leaders, play a vital role in facilitating peaceful resolutions and preventing further escalation. The stakes are too high and the consequence of inaction too severe to allow this conflict to persist unchecked. In conclusion, Mr. President, Mozambique reiterates its appeal for a political negotiated solution as the only viable path to end this conflict and lay the foundation for lasting and sustainable peace between the two neighboring countries. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I wish to thank Mr. Ebel for his briefing. As the crisis in Ukraine continues unabated, large quantities of weapons and ammunition are flowing into the battlefields in more variety and scope, with greater lethality and destruction power, leading to growing risks of loss and proliferation of weapons. Such a situation is deeply worrying. There are no simple solutions to complex issues. Increased weapon supplies to the battlefield will only cause more harm and will not bring lasting peace. Continued advocation of confrontation between camps will only further exacerbate the crisis and make the road to peace even rockier. China believes that the important thing to do now is to adhere to the three principles of no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no provocation by any party in an effort to de-escalate the situation as soon as possible. We call on the parties to the conflict to demonstrate their political will, meet each other halfway in order to reach a ceasefire and the fighting and start peace talks. To this end, we call on the international community to create favorable conditions and provide practical assistance. All parties concerned should give priority to peace and humanitarian concerns by devoting their resources and energy to diplomatic efforts for a ceasefire and end to the fighting. China's position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and clear, that is, to promote peace talks and the political settlement. We will continue to uphold an objective and impartial position, maintain close communication with all parties, promote broader consensus in the international community, and make unremitting efforts for an early political settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. President, I wish to respond to what has just been said by the U.S. delegate. China did not create the Ukraine crisis, nor is it a party to the crisis. China has not provided weapons to any party to the conflict, and China has always strictly controlled our dual-use items. Chinese enterprises carry out their normal economic and trade cooperation with other countries around the world, including Russia and Ukraine, in accordance with the rules of the WTO and market principles, which is reasonable, legitimate, and beyond reproach. As a matter of fact, the United States still maintains trade and economic relations with Russia. The most urgent task for the international community right now is to promote a ceasefire, to stop the war and realize peace. China has been speaking out for peace and calling for all efforts to this end. However, the U.S. has not only turned a blind eye and deaf ear to China's efforts to persuade and promote peace, but repeatedly spread lies in the Security Council and smear China on the issue of Ukraine, which China firmly opposes and absolutely will not accept. We wish to advise the United States that if it truly wants to put an end to the war, it should make efforts together with countries concerned, including China, instead of shirking its responsibilities and creating confrontation. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Director Ibo for the briefing and recognize the presence of the permanent representative of Mali in today's meeting. Guyana joins fellow council members in expressing grave concern about the devastating impacts of the ongoing conflict and the dire humanitarian situation that has arisen in Ukraine as a result of the hostilities. The rising civilian death toll and continued targeting of civilian objects point to an almost willful disregard for the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law. principles that underline the responsibility of any party to an armed conflict to behave in a manner consistent with military necessity, humanity, and proportionality. Guyana condemns all attacks targeting civilians and civilian objects. We demand that the parties comply fully with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We also call for safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all populations in need, including in the occupied regions. Mr. President, 2 days ago, we heard from ASG Yencha that July was the deadliest month for civilians in 2.5 years of armed conflict in Ukraine. According to OHCHR, over 11,000 civilians have been killed, including 639 children. Over 24,000 people have been injured, including over 1,500 children. Most civilian casualties were caused either using explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas or mines and explosive remnants of war. Yet, we continue to receive reports of the transfer or planned transfer of weapons with the capacity to inflict even deadlier and more indiscriminate damage. Mr. President, Guyana shares Mr. Ibo's concern about the risk of diversion of weapons and ammunition transferred to the conflict area. As stated many times in this chamber, the supply of weapons and ammunition into any armed conflict can escalate or prolong the violence and increase the risk of their diversion. Guyana and other countries in the Latin American and Caribbean region know only too well about the deadly impact of the diversion of weapons, especially small arms and light weapons and their ammunition. They account for the majority of homicides in our countries and play a central role in all aspects of transnational organized crime, leading to profound socioeconomic impact and human cost. In other regions, this challenge may be even greater. Guyana, therefore, continues to urge due caution in ensuring that all transfers are transparent within the international legal framework and have provisions for controls to prevent their irregular transfer. We also echo the call for all involved to comply fully with the provisions of international disarmament instruments and to ensure that weapons and ammunition transfers do not violate these instruments or UN Security Council resolutions. Moreover, we maintain that the only effective means of preventing any further escalation or instability in Ukraine and the broader region is to end this war and to end it through peaceful means. We therefore call upon the Russian Federation to withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine and urge the parties to commit to a political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Sierra Leone. I thank Director Ebo for his briefing. I acknowledge the presence of the representative of Mali in this meeting. We take note of the call by the Russian Federation to discuss the risk of spiraling escalation resulting from the increasing weapons transfer by Western countries to Ukraine. At the outset, Sierra Leone reiterates its principal position that all transfers of weapons in conflict situations should occur within the applicable international legal framework and a relevant UN Security Council resolution, and include pre-transfer risk assessment and end-user verification to prevent diversion of arms and ammunition. Sierra Leone is of the view that the conflict in Ukraine has been experiencing a dramatic escalation since March this year to date. While the increase in the intensity of the conflict in the east and the southeast of Ukraine since the start of the conflict is a vertical escalation, the opening of a new front in the Kharkiv region, northeast, in May 2024 marked the beginning of a horizontal escalation. The counter-offensive launched by Ukraine since the 6th August 2024 in Kursk region in Russia continues to increase that horizontal escalation. The consequences of this escalation have been devastating, with intensification of missiles and drone strikes, causing increased civilian deaths, injury, and displacement. Additionally, energy infrastructure and other civilian infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, have been destroyed, with reports of more than 900 schools, hospitals, churches, and other institutions being damaged or destroyed as at June 2024. It is important to note that as we have commemorated the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, it is worth reminding that these sites are protected under the Geneva Conventions. From the above, and with no seeming end in sight of the conflict, Sierra Leone stresses that the conflict involves a vicious cycle with the risk of escalation likely to persist. In this regard, Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which continues to deteriorate at an alarming rate. According to a Protection of Civilians update report released on 9th August by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, it recorded that 35,160 civilian casualties, including 11,520 deaths, have occurred since the conflict began on 24 February 2022. The report highlights that in July alone, at least 209 civilians were killed and 1,018 injured in Ukraine, making it the deadliest month for civilians since October 2022. According to the report, the high casualty count in July is a continuation of a trend of increasing civilian casualties since March 2024. The alarming civilian casualty figures and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine due to the escalation underscores the urgent need for all parties to the conflict to prioritize the protection of civilians and refrain from further escalation and pursue the option, and not to pursue the option of winning the war on the battlefield at all costs. Dialogue and diplomacy should be the primary tools employed to de-escalate tensions and pave the way for peaceful resolution of the conflict. The international community, including this Council, must remain steadfast in its commitment to supporting the pursuit of a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine. Sierra Leone once more calls for good faith diplomatic efforts in pursuit of a peaceful resolution involving the parties to the conflict. Meaningful steps must be taken towards the immediate de-escalation and cessation of hostilities. We urge parties to the conflict to engage constructively, including on their legitimate concerns, to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. In closing, colleagues, Sierra Leone calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities and genuine diplomatic efforts to achieve a peaceful and lasting resolution to the conflict, taking into account legitimate concerns of the parties involved. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I will be brief. I will just say, as I've said many times in this chamber, I will continue to call out those countries, including China, that provide support to Russia's industrial base. I will cease those calls when that support terminates. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. The representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, President. The U.S. delegate, that speech, the statement they made, it's very repetitive, has nothing new in it. On the question of Ukraine, the U.S. has always been saying from high ground, hasn't instead been making concrete efforts for defusing the conflict. We hope in this chamber, the U.S. delegate will stop this useless game. Don't hop the wrong tree. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Since our American colleague is always talking about who's threatening the world or peace and decides to accuse various different states, I'd just like to advise him, why doesn't he take a look more often in the mirror at home, and then he will get a clear answer to his question as to who is threatening whom.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will be equally brief here. Regarding the remarks just made by the representative of the Russian Federation, I would simply point out that he just reinforced all the points I made in my earlier statement. I have nothing more to say. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mali.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, sir. Mr. President, I am pleased on this eve of the end of your presidency of the Security Council to extend to you, as well as to your whole delegation, our warm congratulations for the remarkable work done during this month of August 2024. Mali requested to participate in this meeting essentially to share its deep-seated concerns with regard to the implications and consequences of the supply of weapons to Ukraine, consequences for our countries, for our populations, that are far from the front lines between Russia and the Ukraine. As you know, since the eruption of the crisis between Russia and the Ukraine, the government of Mali has taken a stance of neutrality. And yet, we are increasingly concerned to see this crisis progressively traveling towards regions that are far from the front lines, as you were able to observe last July in Mali, in other words, in the Sahel and even Africa. Indeed, the spokesperson of the Ukrainian Military Intelligence Agency and the ambassador of Ukraine in Senegal both publicly admitted the involvement of their country in the cowardly, treacherous, and barbaric attack on the 24th, 25th, and 26th of July 2024 of terrorist groups that caused the deaths of Malian security and defense forces in Tizawaten in Mali, along with significant material damage that was caused. Worse, Ukrainian high-level officials publicly announced other, quote, results to come. That is deeply concerning. The government of Mali reiterates its strong condemnation of the presumed support of Ukraine to terrorist groups in Mali, the Sahel, and in Africa. And the government of Mali has decided to sever diplomatic ties between Mali and the Ukraine. Mali calls upon the Security Council to uphold its responsibilities, given the deliberate choice of Ukraine, and it should do so in order to prevent the subversive action that threatens the stability of Sahel and even the entire African continent. Given this vexing precedent that I just denounced here, the government of Mali would like to express its alarm with regard to the supply of weapons to Ukraine, because it's been clearly established that a good part of the weapons supplied to Ukraine then end up fueling terrorism and crime in the Sahel, with the risk of further destabilizing our countries and exacerbating the suffering of our people, already sorely tested by several years of conflict with dramatic consequences. We therefore call upon the countries supplying weapons to Ukraine to ensure that said weapons do not fall into the hands of terrorist and extremist groups in the Sahel and in Africa. For its part, Mali has no desire to be used as a proxy battlefield between the powers. Mr. President, I would like to take this opportunity to respond to the ambassador of Algeria, who during the round table celebrating the 75 years of the Geneva Convention on the Law of War, which was held on the 26th of August 2024 in Switzerland, thought it appropriate to state, and I quote, having learned that a drone attack was conducted in the north of Mali, killing some 20 civilians, and I quote, those who pressed the button on the drone to conduct the strike do not have to answer to anyone, end of quote. In response to what he said, I would like to express my astonishment at seeing a diplomat making a statement that is so serious and unsubstantiated on the basis of mere press allegations, by blithely peddling information from the press that has not been verified. He is serving the purposes of terrorist propaganda in our region. For my part, I would like to recall to my Algerian colleague that the Malian security and defense forces are professionals. They have been waging an unwavering war against terrorist groups in the strict respect of human rights and international humanitarian law in order to free our territory and to protect our people and assets. What are we really talking about here? The 25th of August 2024, the Malian Defense and Security Forces conducted offensive reconnaissance and discovered vehicles, pickup trucks, that were loaded with war materials and equipment that were being carefully guarded in a concession in an area of Tizuanen in the northeast of Kidal, in a location there. After careful surveillance, the Malian Defense and Security Forces conducted a series of strikes that allowed them to destroy the terrorist targets and to neutralize some 20 armed men. As you might observe, Mr. Ambassador from Algeria and my dear brother Amar, these were indeed terrorists that our forces neutralized on the 25th of August and not civilians. I would thus invite you to adopt a constructive attitude and a more respectful attitude of Mali and its people, in keeping with the secular ties of good neighbors, fraternity, friendship, and cooperation, which has always existed between our countries, Mali and Algeria. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mali for their statement. The representative of Algeria has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor a second time to quickly respond to the intervention of the permanent representative of Mali. To begin with, there was a reference to a statement delivered by the Algerian permanent representative in Geneva within a context of a meeting on the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. The ambassador's intervention was clear, and it was suitable to its context. And now, I'm required to repeat, to clarify to the distinguished representative of Mali the content of that statement and its aims. This clarification covers the history, the present and the future. The history bears testimony to the role of Algeria with its neighbors and brethren in Mali. There was never a time when my country intended any harm to the state of Mali. Through reiterating the need to distinguish between terrorist acts and legitimate resistance acts, it was a clear statement that emphasizes that no one must doubt the internationally defined terrorism. Algeria, in its counterterrorism efforts, our experience is known. So under no circumstance did Algeria play a role in encouraging terrorism. And to quickly respond as well to the intervention by the distinguished representative of Mali, I emphasize that Algeria continues and has always continues to pursue what serves the interests of Mali, the people of Mali, and all segments of our dear neighbor. Time will reveal the response to and will reveal what neighbors believe. We do not intervene in Mali's decision making or choices. I will make do with saying that time will tell and will address everything that has been mentioned today. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. Before adjourning the meeting, as this is the last scheduled meeting of the Council for the month of August, I would like to express the sincere appreciation of the delegation of Sierra Leone to the members of the Council and to the Secretariat of the Council for all the support they have given us. Indeed, it has been a busy month and one in which we've rallied to consensus on several important issues within our purview. We could not have done it alone and without the hard work, support, and positive contributions of every delegation and the representatives of the Secretariat, including the technical support team, conference service officers, interpreters, verbatim reporters, and security staff. As we end our presidency, I know I speak on behalf of the Council in wishing the delegation of Slovenia good luck in the month of September. The meeting is adjourned.
There was a terrorist attack in Tinzawa 10 in Mali, and the Kiev regime officials boasted about their participation in this attack. After some international perplexion, some of these statements were withdrawn, but nevertheless it never denied the fact that it was helping the terrorists to fight the Malian army and Russian instructors. And also it promised some kind of new developments in the future. I also wanted to tell you that yesterday we had we raised this issue under the any other business in closed consultations, and to our surprise, I would say astonishment, those Western countries who were speaking, they never mentioned the word Ukraine. They were pretending that we raised the issue of situation in Sahel. So I imagine that the situation when the tentacles of Kiev terrorist regime are now as far as in Sahel, and that the arms supplied to Ukraine is finding its way in the arms of terrorists in Sahel, is a very uncomfortable development for them. We have warned about this repeatedly. Now it's happening, and it's the direct consequence of the escalation that the West is promoting in Ukraine. Thank you. Question?
All right. So it's not related to Sahel situation. Do you have any comments on the Russian billionaire Mr. Durov's being charged by the French authorities?
I'm not following this issue in detail, frankly. I think that everybody is worried about freedom of speech in any case, and there are different aspects of this situation. Mr. Durov is not only a citizen of Russia, as you know, so I think that there are a lot of interests implied, and it's a good opportunity for him to really understand right now the true value of Western statements about freedom of speech. But I think I will limit my comments to this. Okay.
Concerning situation in Sahel, does Russia consider offering any product to the Security Council in terms of situation in Sahel and Western weapons ending in this region?
I think it's up to our Sahelian partners to decide whether they need such a product or not. So far they haven't reached out to us with such a product. I think that the statement of representative of Mali was self-explanatory and very powerful, and in my understanding this is enough at this stage, so we'll see how it will develop further. Okay? Okay, thank you everybody. Thank you.